Hey guys, I just had a patient in the clinic who referred to the bruising from cupping. And it just made me think about the way that I talk about this stuff in the clinic because, as we know, it's not bruising, right? It's not fresh blood vessels that we're breaking open with oxygenated blood getting out into the skin layer. This isn't what's happening. It doesn't look like bruising. It doesn't act like bruising. Nothing about it seems to be that. And yet we all use this word for it. So then the question becomes, well, what is it, right? And what the way that I'm going to describe this is really it's representative of how I speak to patients using more like a Western medical kind of terminology. And I think it clears up more what's going on. And in the end of the day, it helps them to understand what's going on and it gets them more committed to it. It aligns the shen, as my teacher would say. So the thing with cupping is it's a suction cup, right? And it's pulling the skin up inside the cup, but it's also pulling the muscle up. And what it does doing that is it actually, as it pulls the muscle belly up, it actually separates the muscle fibers a bit. Now, when we're thinking about sort of chronic injuries or chronic problems, chronic pain, one big assumption around all of that is tight musculature, right? So then the cupping helps to relax the muscles by kind of forcing those muscle fibers apart a bit, and then when they reheal, they're less tight, in theory. And so then the question becomes, okay, fine, but what about the marks that come out? Well, then the way that I think about this is the blood has kind of two jobs. The blood moves into the musculature to bring oxygen, to bring proteins, bring whatever that is coming in there to nourish those muscles. But the second job is to keep the muscles clean, to sort of collect everything, all the old proteins, white blood cells, red blood cells, all these things that need to go back to the liver to either be recycled or dumped out through the gallbladder. That's the blood's job, is to keep the muscles clean. So part of the assumption of tight musculature is that intramuscular blood flow is less efficient when there's tight musculature. So the blood is less able to penetrate into the interior of the musculature, and so these things start to build up. So then when you do the cupping and you pull those muscle fibers apart, everything kind of rushes up to the surface. Right? And this is why what you're looking at is not fresh oxygenated blood in the skin surface. It's old blood, in a sense, right? Because it just looks so different. It just is not on any level representative of bruising at all, right? So anyways, this is a very simple way to look at it. This is how I think about it. And this is how I describe it to my patients when they're curious about it. And like I said, I think that this creates commitment to the treatment because they understand. And my teacher would always say, if you can speak to a patient in a way that they can understand, you will be believed. And part of that belief is the belief that you can do something about it. Showing that you understand the problem implies that you understand the solution, right? This is a common psychology almost trick in a sense, right? Okay. Cupping, in a way, like gua sha is kind of the conceptual opposite of that, right? And so people are always coming in saying, oh, I went and got a massage, and then you say, did it help? And they're like, I mean, I guess a little bit. No, it didn't really help that much, because massage and gua sha are doing the exact same thing, right? They're pushing the muscle in, separating those muscle fibers. But when was the last time you saw somebody get a massage and come out with marks like gua sha marks? So there's something very specific about using that tool that does the same thing as the cupping, just in the opposite direction, separating those muscle fibers. Okay, so it really is a one-up on massage in a sense. Okay. That's cupping. That's how I think about cupping. This is random thoughts that I've been having. I just wrote them down. Another thing I was thinking about is for those of you who do more kind of Shanghanlun type herbology, there is this, in some cases, a bit of an obsession around the preservation of yang. Right? So, you got to keep the yang strong, and that's sort of the basis of everything. And it is, right? That's the yang is the basis for the digestion to do its thing, the lungs to do its thing, the kidney to do its thing, the heart. Everything requires this yang. And so you see, like in some of the Shanghanlun traditions, you see they actually get pretty intense about it, and they start using really big doses of futsa, right? These really hot herbs and that kind of thing. And it's not that it doesn't have its benefits, its effects. I mean, this is a perfectly reasonable thing to do in cases where it's reasonable to do, right? So when the symptomology and the pulse shows that warming is required, this is totally reasonable. But it just makes me think about something that a teacher of mine in China said. He told me, he said, you know, you Americans, you're all liver stagnant. You have an American constitution and you guys are all stagnation of liver. You guys are all liver excess types. And he said, here in China, we're more spleen deficiency types, right? So then you can think about that how you want. I mean, if you look at spleen deficiency, you know, if somebody comes in and says to me, I'm counting the number of sprouts and weighing them out and I'm on this weird diet or something, I immediately am thinking to myself, this is spleen deficiency. Because people with weak spleens, they protect their digestions. They do those kinds of diet things in order to protect themselves. Because people with strong digestions, they don't think about food. Cast iron stomach. They eat whatever they want and they feel the same. It doesn't matter if they eat crummy food or good quality food. They generally notice that they feel more or less the same, you know. So, but then people with relatively weak digestions have to protect their digestions and they have to make rules for themselves around foods. Well, I can't eat gluten because it makes me feel this way and that way. I can't eat dairy. I can't eat certain rules around food. And you certainly do see that in China, that the rules around food are fairly extensive. You know, oh, well, you wouldn't want to eat raw tofu without serving some kind of chili oil or something to kind of offset the coldness of the raw tofu by warming it up, right? Just simple, small rules like this that get quite complex when you really start digging down into Chinese cuisine, right? But so this was this guy's assessment of his own culture, which is that they are sort of a spleen deficiency constitution as a culture, as a country. This is what he's saying. And that one good evidence of this is in their diet, in their ideas around cuisine. And I thought about that, and it seems reasonable because when you look at sort of, let's say, European cuisine, right? It's not so rule bound. There's not so many things that you have to follow. I mean, there are things, but it's nothing like Chinese, Japanese, you know, Korean. Like there's so many things about cooking in that situation that you have all these little rules you have to follow. You know, all the little things, pairing things together and stuff. You have this thing in general in European, but that's not like the way you see it in Asia. Because if the Europeans are somewhat more liver excess, then that means that their spleens are relatively stronger than their Asian counterparts. And so then they're not going to think about their diet as much. They don't have to protect their digestions as much, right? So then it made me think about the notion of, you know, sort of, well, what do we do with the notion of like a classic kind of Shanghanlun thing where it's all protect the yang? But that may be a cultural bias. That may be a sort of genetic bias from China, from Asia generally, that if because when you have spleen types, earth types, that kind of constitution, you're worried more in that case about qi deficiency and ultimately yang deficiency. But in liver excess types, liver types in general, you're worried much more about blood deficiency and ultimately yin deficiency. And it certainly fits for me, at least where I live in Southern California, in the clinic that I'm in, and the types of patients, adult patients that I see far more yin deficiency, blood deficiency, dryness issues, all that kind of thing, far more than I see just kind of out and out qi deficiency and certainly yang deficiency. I see yang deficiency, certainly. I see it all the time, but nothing compared to what I see in terms of blood deficiency and yin deficiency. And so I was just thinking about that, you know, this notion of cultural bias, this sort of genetic bias between different countries. There may be something there, you know, when you're thinking about that kind of thing. Anyways, it kind of just was something I was thinking about. It's funny with the constitutional thing. Actually, there's in the Japanese situation, when you look at their acupuncture styles, they're much more concerned about not over treating the patient. That if you do too much treatment, that it may actually cause them to be worse, to be more tired. But I think this again is a bias more towards, for people who have a tendency more towards qi deficiency, a bias towards people who are going to have more yang deficiency. So certainly for my patients who come in and see me that are more qi and yang deficient, I'm much more mindful about this. I'm much more likely to warm them with moxa, right? So when you look at acupuncture, there is no acupuncture without moxa. But that, to some degree, might even be an Asian bias. And moxa may be less important here in our context, treating, different races. It's possible. All of my Japanese compatriots are all up in arms right now, but it's just something that I think about. Is moxa as useful? Am I using it as much for a European-based population, for example? I'm not sure that I do, or that I need to all the time. I certainly see coldness, but I see a lot more stagnation. I see a lot more fluid deficiencies, these kinds of things. That requires a different approach, right? It may require different needling techniques and that kind of thing. You know where I see this? In the Japanese system, again, in pediatrics, where I treat a lot, is the notion of a broken treatment. That, let's say a kid comes in, and this comes from Japan, from their shonishin tradition, their kind of massage traditions. That if you overtreat a kid with a fever, that it may kind of damage their internal chi mechanism and cause the fever to go higher. Right? You sort of damage their system, and then the fever gets worse because you kind of blew out the kid a little bit, over-treated them and damaged their chi. And the thing about it is that I almost never see that in my more European-based, genetic-based population. I just don't see it happen with them. I treat them a lot when they have a fever, and they get better. The only time I ever see broken treatments is among my Asian patients. So this question about, again, sort of genetic bias in that sense, the difference, thinking of a culture as having a constitution, in this very general way. And again, I was introduced to this idea in China by a Chinese professor, so it wasn't my idea. It just sort of got me thinking about it a lot, all this kind of stuff. So anyways, things that I've been thinking about. Another thing that was thinking about recently, because a patient came in and was asking me about it, was this notion of sort of supplements and how to manage supplements from a perspective of Chinese medicine. So anyone who's been doing it for a minute has the notion, they have their ideas about what they think, different supplements might do from a Chinese medicine perspective. Like, I think coenzyme Q10, strengthens the yang or something like that, right? So these notions about that. And a patient asked me, well, what about coffee? There's been a bit of a cultural question, and a sort of outstanding cultural question about, is coffee healthy for us? Or is coffee bad for you? The same with alcohol, right? But coffee has been a big one. And it seems that the research seems to indicate that coffee is actually a healthy drink. That the bean itself is not the problem with coffee. It's what we put around it. Excessive amounts of sugar and maybe dairy problems and low quality and exposure to pesticides and these kinds of things that occur in these situations. Maybe these are where the problems arise in coffee, but not based on a bean, hot bean water. I mean, from a Chinese perspective, there's no reason to assume that coffee is bad for you just as a food, as an herb. So when you look at the way that the Chinese think about what coffee does, in a very general way, you see that they say, it's fairly neutral in temperature. But what it does, the way that it works, is it's sort of like a qi regulator. So it's not hot or cold in any particular direction. It regulates chi, and it has a somewhat drying effect on the system. So that the effect that you feel from drinking coffee is actually like the physical effects that you feel from drinking the coffee are actually the sensation of regulating your chi, having your chi moved. I mean, how many times have you drank coffee and, it kicks in and the world just seems a little brighter, And it's like, that's your chi moving. You're getting access to energy that was kind of locked up before, in a sense. Certainly, coffee is not like ginseng. Like I don't think of coffee as as a chi tonic in the same way that ginseng is. It doesn't feel like that. It doesn't act like that. Ginseng, you take it over time and it builds up strengthens your digestive system. It develops your digestive system so that when you stop taking it, you stay good. You feel good for a time because the ginseng kind of trains your body, strengthens your body, and then you can stay good even without it. But coffee is not like that. It doesn't build up your chi mechanism. It doesn't build up your ability. It doesn't like strengthen your digestion and your ability to create chi for yourself the way ginseng does. Right? So it's not a chi tonic. So it's not like the extra energy you feel is coming from some kind of chi tonic. It doesn't feel like a yang tonic either in a sense. So I think for me, just the experience of it, I think, is much more like what they sort of say, this notion of it's a chi regulator. It helps stagnant chi to move. But in its moving of chi, it also is a little bit dry. So it's a bit like chai hu in that sense. Because every time you move stagnant chi, the chi moves through the body and the blood will follow. Right? Which means ultimately that you're using up a little bit of your blood. So the chi moves, the blood follows. Coffee, you have more energy, you're doing more rather than just resting, which is probably what we all should be doing. So we're doing a bunch of stuff, but to do something requires blood. Then you lay down maybe for bed and you rest, and what happens? The blood retreats back to the liver. The liver stores the blood. But by definition, in that situation, you're going to have a little bit less blood than you had. So in a sense, the coffee pushes you to be more active. More chi is flowing through the channels, it's being made available, but that also means you're using blood. So it's not like it happens right away that you're going to drink coffee and then you're going to be blood deficient or something. I think it's a very slow roll. I mean, you look at chai hu, from a TCM perspective, when we prescribe chai hu, we're often prescribing what along with it? Bai Shao. And in this case, what is the Bai Shao doing? It's kind of softening the roughness of chai hu. It's sort of softening the drying effect that chai hu might have. And sometimes I think about it this way, like you more liver types will understand what I mean. You earth types won't get this, but you liver types, what does it feel like to drink too much coffee? You're edgy, and you're uncomfortable. That's kind of that blood deficiency. It's a lack of yin in the system. The yin isn't anchoring and calming your shen. So it's easy for your blood deficiency to be shown, to be sort of instigated by this movement. Then suddenly there's this blood deficiency. All this chi is moving around in the context of a blood deficiency. It's rough. The chi movement isn't smooth. So you feel edgy. You don't feel necessarily the best. This is too much coffee. You earth types don't get it. You guys drink your bowl of coffee 3 times a day and you feel the same because you guys have a lot of yin. Now, your problem may be that the yin that you have is often dampness in a sense rather than like good quality blood. But this is a whole other discussion. But still, but this notion of coffee as a chi regulator. So then when we think about saying to ourselves, okay, is coffee healthy? Well, within the context of TCM, certainly it could be. We could make the argument that it's healthy because regulating your chi is a healthy thing to do, right? What do we usually do that? We do that through breathing. Metal regulates wood, right? Well, in this case, it's sort of almost like a spiciness of coffee from an herbal perspective. Not that it's spicy, but an acridity It regulates the chi, but you have to be careful that it's drying. I often had the idea, why not make coffee granules mixed with like, you know, Chinese herbal granules? You know, put a dangui or baishao or something, you know, pair it together so that every time you're drinking coffee, at least you're getting some blood tonic. I don't know how much it would help to actually smooth it in that moment, but over time, at least you'd be building blood while you're, you know, drying yourself out the same way that we would think to do it in herbology. Anyways, this notion about, you know, what's the effect of coffee? And what it did was the question kind of led me to think about, like, you know, I live in California where it's all legal marijuana, legal cannabis, as everyone calls it now. And I actually think of cannabis as having a very similar effect as coffee in that it's a chi regulator. You know, so a lot of people smoke cannabis or ingest cannabis, and then what do they feel? Relaxed. You know, relaxed in the same way that maybe alcohol might relax them, in the sense that alcohol is a chi regulator. It moves the liver, among other things that alcohol does. It regulates your chi, right? So you always know somebody by how they get drunk. So like happy drunks, they're more like spleen or a liver overacting on spleen. So as soon as they start drinking, the liver backs off, and then their nice earthy energy comes out, and they get a little bit of alcohol in them. Suddenly they're having fun and they're happy and all this. It's a clear indication that probably their main pathology has to do with liver overacting on spleen. That sweetness comes out suddenly. Whereas some people, when they drink alcohol, what do? They get argumentative and feisty and angry and stuff like that, indicating that their main issue is really just liver stagnation, and there's a lot of heat underneath, so that drinking alcohol and the chi regulating that occurs there suddenly releases that heat outwards. And now they're kind of an angry drunk. So it gives you a clue as to what their underlying physiology is actually like. I actually have a friend who won't smoke cannabis because she gets angry when she smokes cannabis. And she also does get fairly argumentative and confrontational when she drinks even a small amount of alcohol. So it's a clear indication as to what her pathophysiology is like, you know, kind of what her constitution is like, what her situation is, right? So I think then the question becomes one of, you know, how unhealthy is cannabis? Now, of course, there's the issue of smoking it and the heat going into the lungs and that heat getting into the heart and stuff. That's obviously not so good, and tar and whatever. But it also, I think, suffers from the same problem as coffee, in that being a chi regulator, it does ultimately lead to dryness. And in that sense is not a healthy coping mechanism for stress in a certain way. Because I mean, you know, I've been around. It's like, I know a lot of old stoners, and you'd think they'd be more happy than they are. A lot of old stoners, they get more irritable as they get older. You know, and they look dry and kind of sour and a little astringed or something, you know, little tight lips or something like that. And, you know, I think it's an indication that, number one, they've been regulating their chi externally, which leads to blood deficiency, leads to yin deficiency, but it doesn't show itself for a really long time. I mean, you got to have a good, solid, dedicated habit for a good 20 years, maybe 15 years, I don't know, and before it really starts to show itself. But I know a lot of old stoners who strike me as not as happy as they should be, given their, given their meditation of choice, so I suppose. So I think it sort of suffers from the same problem as coffee in that sense, that it over time will dry you out through its chi regulating faculty. Okay. And then that discussion led me to think about, this has been a few years on now, but, you know, patients coming to you asking questions about things like ayahuasca. Right. So what was that, like 5-6 years ago? That started really hitting the market there, and I had people coming out of the woodwork asking me about it that I would not have thought would have known anything about it, but suddenly everyone's hearing about it. I feel like that's fallen off a lot. You know, the chic of it, or the rush to find out about what it is and what the potential benefits might be. But still, a lot of people around thinking about it, talking about it, using it. And my I think the way to think about that is to kind of step back and look at ayahuasca in its cultural context. So, for those of you who don't know what I'm talking about, ayahuasca is a psychedelic beverage, which comes from the Amazon basin, countries like Colombia and like that. And it's an admixture of two plants cooked together, and then you drink it, and it causes hallucinations, let's say. And these hallucinations may help, or whatever whatever people are saying about it. But if you look at the cultural context of how this beverage is used, it really is used for healing. That's its main function. It's medicine. But when you really look, it varies quite a bit in terms of how different sort of shamans in these areas, the sort of local doctor, your local herbologist, the different shamans in different areas will have different techniques. And I'm going to make a judgment here, but I thought that the most advanced sort of technique that I ever encountered in this situation was one that I saw, or not saw, but kind of heard stories about, coming out of Peru, where the way that it worked down there, the way that the healing would work down there, is the shaman would cook up a batch of this stuff, and on a Saturday night, anyone wishing to be healed would come to the longhouse or whatever, and the shaman himself or herself, but generally himself, would drink this drink and then would feed it also to the person wishing to be healed. And then what would happen is kind of at least the shaman is sort of hallucinating. And what the shaman will do is the patient will sort of sit on their haunches, they're sort of crouching down, and the shaman will go up behind the patient and look at their back. And sort of hallucinating in this situation, will see patterns drawn on the back, sort of living, sort of geometric shapes. If you've ever seen sort of local Peruvian art, these lines and circles, very simple art, but these are actually representations of what the shaman sees when he looks at this person's back. And the entire back, as this sort of canvas, all of the designs are there, and they should be pretty whole, in the sense that there shouldn't be any areas on the back where the picture is somehow muddled or messed up. But invariably, when somebody is quite sick, there will be these areas on the back, let's just say, for example, on the shoulder or something, where suddenly the shapes and the lines and circles are all kind of garbled and dark and not whole, not fitting with the rest of it. And this may be a representation of this person's disease. And so then the shaman's job in that situation is to sing a song, and in singing the song, the music, the sound itself is what ultimately fixes that garbled visual area, so that in singing it, then the shaman looking at that area will notice that the song affects that garbled area on the patient's back, and the visual nature of it will start to change, and it'll start to fit more with the rest of the back, these beautiful lines and circles, these geometric patterns. And this is an indication for the shaman, okay, this person will get better. Maybe if the symptom persists, come back next week and I'll sing a song again at this area and we'll get it sorted. Now, the real power of the shaman in this situation is how many songs he or she knows, because each geometric pattern that person sees is related to one song, meaning that when you sing that song, it produces that particular pattern. And if you see a pattern that you don't know the song, the paired song, the song that goes to that pattern, you're a bit up a creek, as we say. And so that you can't, so the power of the shaman is in how many songs he or she knows in this situation. So if they see something they don't know, they might have to extract that person, from the social milieu of the normal daytime thing, and take them out to the sort of the edge of the jungle and spend more personal time with them, than kind of communing with the spirit of that plant, the plants in ayahuasca, with the spirit of the plant, communing with that plant, asking specifically, can you teach me the song that will fix this person? And if that shaman then can't learn the song, isn't learning the song, can't figure it out, they may even take that person to the next village over where a friend of theirs may be. Maybe they know the song. Leave the patient in the care of a different shaman who might know that song. So this is kind of how this is done. These songs are called Icaros. Nice word, I like that. And so this is what happens generally, let's say, on a Saturday night. Anyone wishing to be healed, there could be, 3, 4, 5, 6 people or whatever, and they all come to be healed, and the shaman does the work, and then and that's maybe a Saturday night. So people wishing to be healed, and this may take multiple treatments. It could take 4, 5, 6, 7 treatments. It could take a long time to heal. They come back the next week. It's better, but not as good as it was. It sounds like acupuncture to a degree. Interestingly, my old mentor, he said, I used to assist him in the clinic, and I would dutifully write down the point combinations that he was using and try to kind of reverse engineer it to figure out what he was thinking, given what I know about the patient already. And if there was something I couldn't understand, I might ask a question. And sometimes he would be like, "What?" I would ask, like, "Hey, why did you do those points?" And he'd look at me, which patient? That's one. He's like, I don't know. I'd be like, okay. And then he'd be like, well, let me see the paper. And then I'd show him the piece of paper. He's like, yeah, that is odd, isn't it? And I'd be like, yeah, okay. And then he'd just kind of leave it at that. Well, finally, I kind of pinned him on it. I was like, hey, this has happened too many times that you're brushing me off here, buddy. And he said, well, look, man, here's the deal. Like, I've been treating 60 patients a week for, 25 years or whatever it had been at that, 30 years it had been at that point. And he was like, look, sometimes now, like when everything's just clicking right for me, I just walk in, the patient pulls up their pant leg over their knee and, exposes their abdomen. I can see their arms and stuff. He's like, I can just see which points need to be needled. I just see it on their skin. I just know. And he's like, in that situation, questioning is a formality. It's for the patient. It's not for me. I don't actually, he would say something like, don't confuse me with the facts. Because what he said is that if he ever didn't follow what he saw, his results were not that good. He's like, the more I followed that thing, and it was just for him, it wasn't like some airy-fairy intuition about which points to use. It was just visual. He would just walk in and just see them. It was not like, it wasn't woo-woo at all. It was just very matter of fact. There's the points. And he said, the more I followed that, the better my results were. And then he had some kind of thing he said one time. He goes, I don't know. The longer I do Chinese medicine, the less I understand about how it works, and the better my results get. And this visual aspect to this is kind of what he was talking about. So there seems to be, some dovetailing here. Well, okay, so these shamans are using this ayahuasca drink, yahe, on maybe a Saturday night. Then on some of the Wednesday nights, for example, the shaman would brew up a separate batch, probably something stronger, and he would dose his friends. Right? So then he would dose his friends, and then they would go and find a smaller hut on the edge of the village, and they would sit inside this hut and completely seal it off so that zero light was coming in. I mean dark, like zero light, And what they would do is sit in a circle around the rim of the inside of this hut, and they would all face the center, and each of them would take turns singing songs. Probably ancient songs, right? And the songs, then, the way they would describe the experience was that the song itself would produce a visual image in the center of the hut that all of them could see. And they would all be seeing the same thing. And the first German ethnographers who came upon this had this experience, commented on it, and said, for example, that 5, 6, 7 hours later, when the trip was finished, and the old boys of the village would be standing around outside, waiting for the sun to come up, smoking some cigars or something, just kind of hanging out, that their critiques of each other's songs would be visual. Oh, I liked how you built that cityscape, but I thought that the mauve striping was a bit ostentatious, or something like this. These sort of visual, and this kind of threw these German ethnographers off, and then they finally had the experience and then reported that this was what was happening, and they actually. So, anyways, so then again, here this sort of visual nature of language, this visual nature of healing. In fact, so that in a sense, even without the presence of a drug, if you're paying attention to information, so to speak, that really paying attention to the skin, paying attention to the body, that there's a lot more information out there than we're used to seeing, or used to thinking about. Anyways, this is I don't tell this whole story to patients when they ask me about it. My attitude is a bit more, well, look. It's fairly harmless to try, it's not going to whack you out or anything like that, and you may learn something about yourself, because then the shaman on a Saturday night, say, treats people who are sick. On a Wednesday night, he doses his friends, and then every so often he goes to the edge of the village. I mean, the shaman is usually kind of on the edge of society anyways. He goes to his hut on the edge of the village, and he'll dose himself, what has been referred to as a heroic dose, a dose at levels at which kind of hanging onto the floor is the only function that you're sort of executing in that situation. But that's the time where the shaman learns the songs, hears the songs, and hallucinates the visuals that go with it, and it's his job to remember the visuals and the song. It's like a download of information, all kinds of information. Where should they move for the hunt? Who stole the chicken? You might be able to see these things and be fed this information by the spirits. New plant medicines and these sorts of things. But this notion that there is anyways, so like I said, I don't describe all of this to the patient, but there is this is how this stuff works, and that when people in the West here want to go out and take a drug like that, like ayahuasca, that you're sort of doing it from the shaman's path, so to speak. You're sort of taking the shaman's path. In a sense, because you're there, in a sense, by yourself. You're doing your thing. You're taking a drug, and then you're sort of closing your eyes and going internal and looking at yourself, looking at your internal terrain, the invisible landscape, as it's been called. So you're sort of observing your internal terrain. It's a meditation. And in that moment, the drug itself strengthens your ability to see yourself clearly. And ultimately does create a situation where it is easier to affect your own chi, to see your own stagnations and to move them. Maybe they're childhood traumas, these kinds of things. And that you'll see your childhood trauma as a stagnation. So it's not that you're reliving some childhood trauma, it's that you suddenly have the realization that you carry that trauma as a form of muscular tension and an energetic tension. And that in that moment, it also gives you the strength to move the chi with your shen, to move that chi with your mind. It gives you a chance to heal thyself, so to speak. And you come out of that situation with information. Then when you go back home and you're not taking the drug, then you use that information, and then you just close your eyes and look for the same stagnation and learn to breathe into it, learn to work with it, learn to relax it. In some texts, chi stagnation is the beginning of all disease, right? So resolving those stagnations as you see them. This is what these things can teach you to do, right? But you have to go into it with that mindset. You don't just go into it with the mindset like, it's like, I'm going to go on a roller coaster and the whole thing's just going to be nuts. There's a measure of just paying attention here that serves you well in those situations. Just keep your wits about you to some degree, if possible. I mean, like I said, sometimes just hanging on to the floor is about all you can get done. But so this is my thought process about what these drugs are meant to do, how they work, what my observations are, experience-wise, research-wise. This is what I see. So when my patients come to me, I'm more informed. When I go into those situations, maybe I'm more informed. So I can be more effective in that moment, work with it, right? Okay, anyways, that's all I was been thinking about. All right, you guys, hey, take it easy. Reach out to me. Some of you have been reaching out to me, and I love to hear from you. If you have topics you want to hear, if you want to talk to me, you want to do an interview or something, and you think it'd be interesting, hit me up. I'm always here for you guys. Okay, y'all, take it easy. Bye.
Lowe's knows how to help make your home holiday ready for less. Get Select Style Selections vinyl flooring for just $1.99 per square foot and have it installed before the festivities begin. Our team can help you every step of the way. See a Lowe's Red Vest associate or visit Lowe's.com/holiday install to get started. Lowe's, we help, you save. Basic install only. Date restrictions apply. Subject to availability. Installed by independent contractors. See associate for details. Contiguous U.S. only.